All right, babies, scope modeling. What's the purpose? Scope modeling the scope is making sure you don't think way outside of the box, right? You have to have constraints, or else creativity can run loose and you kind of like screw yourself over. Scope models define the nature of one or more limits or boundaries and place elements inside or outside those boundaries. In the description, scope models are commonly used to describe the boundaries of control, change a solution or a need. They may also be used to delimit any simple boundary as distinct from horizons, emergent properties, and recursive systems. These models may show elements that include in scope. The model identifies the boundary as seen from the inside. Out of scope, the model identifies the boundary as seen from the outside, as well as the elements not constrained by the boundary, and both. The model identifies boundary as seen from both sides, as well as elements of both sides. Amazing. It's like it was to be able to do something, you have to see inside the box, outside the box, and how the box looks like. Scope models provide the basis for understanding the boundaries of scope of control, what is being analyzed, roles, responsibilities, and what is the internal and external organization. Remember, not every move means the whole organization is moving, right? Scope of needs, stakeholder needs, value to be delivered, functional areas and organizational units to be explored. Scope of solution, requirements met, value delivered, or impact of change. Actions to be taken, stakeholders affected or involved, and events to cause or prevent. What are the scope models are typically represented as a combination of diagrams, matrices, and contextual explanations. So there's scope of control, or where we have control, scope of need, or where are the things that are needed, because you could always do more, but is it necessary? Scope of the solution, as in the solution from A to B versus from A to C versus from A to Z. And the scope of change, or where to expect the change to look like, because yes, I am planting a new tree on the land, but I'm not expecting the whole sky to be covered within a year, right? Something like that. What about the elements? Objectives. The elements are objectives, scope of change and context, scope, level of detail, and relationships. Wow, there's also assumptions and scope modeling results. So they're interesting. Because first things first, you kind of lay down the objectives. Models are typically used to clarify the span of control, relevance of the elements, and where effort will be applied. Depending on the action of stakeholders' needs, the model supports a business analyst determines the types of models that to be used and select boundaries and elements. Scope of change in context. Typically, business analysts are concerned with elements that will be altered as part of the change. That's basically the change in context, as well as the external elements that are relevant to the change. For example, for elements inside the scope of change, the business analyst is involved in establishing the ways those elements are modified. For elements outside the scope of change, but relevant of the change, the business analyst is involved in establishing the interactions between the change and the current and proposed solutions of the context. So it determines often the business process to be defined by or modified, the functions to be added. The scope kind of is kind of the outline of everything that will be done. The functions to be added, changed, optimized, reassigned, new capabilities to be built or existing capabilities to change. External and internal events to be responded to, use case and situations to be supported, technologies to be changed and replaced, informational assets to be acquired, produced, or processed, stakeholders and organizational roles impacted by the change, external and internal agents and agencies impacted by the change. Every single thing that we kind of could communicate with or connect with or has a part of the analysis that we're doing is kind of here, right? Organizational units, departments, organizations, systems, components, tools, all of them. Level of detail. The purpose of analysis defines the appropriate level of abstraction of which the scope elements are described. So the level of detail is kind of decided by the scope. A proper level of detail provides a meaningful reduction of uncertainty while preventing analysis paralysis at a scope definition stage. The elements of a final scope model can be described by enumerating them, referring to a specific level of their decomposition hierarchy. Remember, decomposition is a word that they use. I would rather use deconstruction, because decomposition means literally it decomposes, it dies, it kind of goes back to dirt. Or by grouping them logically. For example, here it's just kind of describing how to kind of organize your details or how to kind of do these things. And so you could either put them behind, the elements could be put behind each other, basically, or you can actually create a hierarchy from top to bottom or bottom to top, or by grouping them logically around sets. I think we kind of like did that while we were like, when we were mind mapping, we talked about that when we were basically like discussing decision modeling. We were also like talking about that. A subject of change can be defined as a list of specific business processes, a high-level business process encompassing all of them, or a generic business function, similarly stakeholders included in the scope. So you can also split it into different big parts and small parts for different kinds of stakeholders, which adds layers to your detailing, correct? For relationships, exploring relationships between potential scope elements to help ensure completeness and integrity of the scope model by identifying their dependencies, fuck yeah. Or by discovering other elements involved or impacted by the change. Like various diagramming techniques are available. Parent-child or composition subset relates elements to the same type by way of hierarchical decompositions. They appear as a chart, class-entity relationship diagram. There's functional responsibility relates to function with agent, stakeholder relation units, organizational unit or solution component that is responsible for its execution. That's the function and its responsibility and what it's connected to. Supplier consumer relates elements by the way the transmission of information or materials between them do that. We also discussed this when it comes to data and data mining. There's a cause and effect. You could also create like model it around like this causes this to happen and therefore this happens. And there's emergent. Emergent are complex systems. Amazing. Because in most complex systems, several elements can interact and produce results that cannot be predicted, which is awesome because it's dynamic and it's always evolving. And number 5, there's assumptions. At a time of scope modeling, the validity of the model heavily relies on assumptions such as the definition of needs, causality of outcomes, impact of changes, applicability and feasibility of the solution. The resulting scope model should include explicit statements of critical assumptions and their implications. Remember, anytime you're assuming something, you're kind of like assuming risk with it, or you're creating risk with it. So like, keep that in mind. Scope modeling results. The result of scope modeling can be represented as textual descriptions of elements, including criteria for making in-scope or out-of-scope decisions, diagrams illustrating memberships or scope elements, and matrices depicting dependencies between them. This is how we basically like, we either write the scope, we either create diagrams or matrices to kind of like connect them together. Your choice. There are many ways, many tools for you to do that. It's a visual thing. What about the consideration? Strengths. Scope model facilitates agreements as a basis for defining contractual obligations, estimating the project effort, justifying the scope and out of scope decisions and requirement analysis. It kind of like splits within and without, and kind of like creates an easier way for us to approach them. And assessing the completeness and impact of solutions and impact of solutions. Limitations. An initial high-level model can lack sufficient level of granularity, particularly for boundary elements that is needed to ensure clear scope identification. Once the scope is defined, changing it may be difficult due to political reasons and contractual obligations, because ultimately, like with every contract, because there are multiple factors. Meanwhile, many factors can affect the scope validity before the targets are achieved. Such factors are wrong initial assumptions, situation change, evolution of stakeholder needs, and technology innovations may cause a need for revising the scope partially or entirely. That's something to consider. I don't think it's a limitation, but I think it's kind of like valid because every time you're talking to people, you're interacting with people. That kind of thing kind of like is interesting. Yeah, I mean, like even contracts could be dynamic the same way you are, right? What about traditional scope models cannot address common complex boundaries such as a horizon, a boundary that is completely dependent on the position of the stakeholder? All right, amazing. Sequence diagrams. What's the purpose? Sequence diagrams are used to model the logic of usage scenarios by showing the information passed between objects in the system through the exception of the scenario. What about description? A sequence diagram. Wait, I'm jumping to sequence diagrams. My bad, man. This video's done. I love you.